I wonder why there are so many Bible verses where God tells us not to be afraid. If the count in that video clip is correct, there's a different do not be afraid verse for every single day of the year. I mean, that's a lot of verses. So why so many verses telling us don't be afraid? Well, probably because we are. Afraid, that is. Afraid more often than not. More often than we care to admit. Life sometimes just seems to be throwing fear right in our laps, as well as, waiting for something to happen that God promises. Well, that throws fear into our laps too. Our faith fluctuates, doesn't it? I mean, sometimes it's rock solid. We are right there, trusting God, believing His promises, but then the next moment, not. We start to get afraid. And we start to wonder as if, despite God's promises to the contrary, that maybe we're facing the stuff we're facing all by ourselves. As we turn the page in Abraham's story to chapter 15, I kind of wonder if that's what Abram's afraid of. That maybe God has left him. That maybe God has abandoned him. That maybe God's forgotten about His promise. And that maybe Abram's thinking he's all alone. Now, it wasn't always like that. I mean, at God's word, Abram left home and set out for this place that God was going to show him. And he really felt God's presence. And when he messed up in Egypt and God got him turned around and heading back to the promised land, well, again, Abram felt God's presence. And when he went off to rescue Lot, he felt God's presence. When he returned from that and this king Melchizedek comes out and blesses him in front of a whole bunch of people, again, he felt God's presence. And when God repeated the promise to him a few different times, he felt God's presence. But now as the scene unfolds in chapter 15, not so much. Let's look in on the story and see if we can figure out why.
Sometime later, Abram had a vision. The Lord said to him, "Abram, do not be afraid. I am like a shield to you. I am your very great reward." But Abram said, "Lord and King, what can you give me? I still don't have any children. My servant Eliezer comes from Damascus. When I die, he will get everything I own." Abram continued, "You haven't given me any children, so this servant of mine will get everything I own."
So what's Abram afraid of here? I mean, he's just had a big victory against a bunch of kings. Another king, Melchizedek, came out and blessed him in front of a whole big crowd. I mean, Abram seems to be doing just fine. Quite successful by other people's standards. Nothing really to be afraid of, except that Abram's still waiting for something big that God's promised. And he's no closer to it now than he was when he started out. Let me read verse 3 again. Abram continued, "You haven't given me any children, so this servant of mine will get everything that I own." See, Abraham left home because of God's promise, that promise of a nation, of a land, and especially of a people, of a son, of a child. But Abram's still waiting to see any of it. He's left home. He's followed God's calling. He's obeyed God, mostly. But what has actually changed? All right, Abram's still no closer to seeing any of that promise, to any of that promise becoming a reality. No child, no land, still no nation, and still waiting. And waiting is hard. And as the waiting continues, I think that maybe what Abram's most afraid of here is that God's words are just words and nothing more. Empty and unfulfilled promises, and that scares him. I mean, Abram's left everything for what? I mean, nothing that he can see. And what he does see leaves him probably with more questions than answers. What have I gotten myself into? How long will I have to wait? Will I ever have this kid that you keep talking about? Seems kind of important to the promise, and we're not getting any younger here. Has God forgotten me? Is God going back on his word? Is God even able to keep these promises anymore, or am I all out here alone, far from home and nothing to show for it? I mean, that's what scares Abram, I think. And I don't think it's too hard to imagine what's going on, because my guess is, like me, maybe you've had some of those same thoughts yourself. Waiting is hard. Waiting on God is hard. Stop and think about that for a moment. Before moving on, press pause and think about this. When have you felt that God's taken too long in keeping his promises? And what scares you about that? It's pretty hard to avoid those moments of fear, isn't it? Especially when things aren't working out exactly the way that you want them to or expected them to, or when you have to wait for something. I mean, you might even be there right now. It happens. So the important question isn't so much how do we avoid spots like that, as it is how do we get through spots like that, right? And when I look at this part of Abram's story, what I'm starting to see is that this getting through, well, it has a whole lot more to do with God than it does with us. The first thing I notice here is that God's actually aware of our fears and our floundering faith. It's important to understand. God is aware. I mean, here's what I'm getting at. The story here is you read that, doesn't show Abram coming to God about his fears. Now, he's got them. He's got them, but, well, maybe he's trying to hide them. Or maybe he's trying to work through them all by himself, and not very successfully, I might add. But Abram doesn't talk about what he's scared about at all until after God comes and initiates this conversation. Well, so how does God being aware of Abram's fears help Abram make it through those fears? Well, remember, part of what Abram's scared about is that maybe God's left him, that God's maybe even unaware of or unconcerned about his current situation. And, well, wrong. God knows all about what Abram's feeling, and he's concerned about his situation, and he's concerned about his floundering faith, and God doesn't want him to stay there. So what does God do? God shows up. God's aware. God shows up. He comes to Abraham, and in a vision, he speaks to those fears to remind Abraham, I'm still here. Abraham, I'm near, I'm close. You are not alone. God shows up. Well, that's been important for me too. That's one of the reasons that I do verse of the day. Right? To me, that's a daily reminder that God's close. And I am amazed how many times that randomly generated verse of the day just seems to be speaking into something that's going on in my life right at that moment and reminding me, yeah, you're not alone. God is close. God is here. Same thing with why I memorize some Bible. See, I memorize that because I find when I start getting worried or afraid, sometimes God just brings one of those verses I've memorized back into my mind, almost like God's speaking directly to me again and saying, I'm near. You're not alone. That's one of the things I find about in-person worship too. That the singing and the talking with other people about God reminds me that God's there, that God's right here, that I'm not alone. And again, that in-person worship seems to draw me into the presence and the promises of God. Now, when you're waiting on God's promise, and you're wondering if his promises are going to come true, and you're feeling sort of alone, I think this part of Abram's story, this first part where God says, Abram, I know what's going on, I'm aware, and he shows up, it reminds you that God is still there, and that he still cares about you, and he cares about what you're feeling, and he wants to help you through that kind of yucky space of fear and floundering faith, and lead you to a place of greater faith and trust. So yeah, God's aware of our floundering faith, and God's aware of our fears. And God comes to you to help even before you turn to him. And then, third thing I notice here is this, that God, as he comes to you, redirects you. Right? He redirects you and reminds you to consider not just the situation you're in, but also to consider the relationship that you're in. Let me read again to you the first thing God says, chapter 15, verse 1. Do not be afraid, I am like a shield to you. I am your very great reward. Even before Abram voices what he's afraid of, and he's going to do that in a couple sentences, God directs Abraham not to the situation that he sees, or more accurately, to the lack of answers that he sees, but God instead directs Abram to the one who made the promise in the first place. He's saying, Abram, who am I? Who am I? And what have you seen me do already? Remember, I am your shield, meaning I'm your protector, I'm your defender, and you've seen that so many times already. You've seen how I've brought you here, how I've kept you safe, how when you messed up, I kept you safe, and I brought you back and turned you around and got you back on course, how I protected you over and over and over again, how I've given you stuff, how I keep rewarding you, so don't worry, I'll keep my promises, and I'm your reward. Meaning that, Abram, along the way, you're going to start discovering that our relationship, right, the friendship, the companionship you have with me, that's a great reward in itself. In fact, Abram, it's the greatest reward of all. So what God is telling us here is, when you're afraid, look past just the situation and trust the person who makes the promise. And again, it's kind of like when your parent promises you that you're a little kid, and the parent promises you that you're going to get something for Christmas coming up way far in the future. Right? You might be waiting for a long time, and you might get kind of antsy while you're waiting, but while you're waiting, you trust that you're going to get that something, and you're going to trust that it's something good, because you know your parent, and you trust them, and you trust the relationship, and that's what God's getting at here. I like how Psalm 56 puts it. When I am afraid, I will trust in you. Something really struck me as I watched that video, because I think it really connects with Abram's story and with ours, this whole thing about living through waiting and the fears that come with that. So I actually wrote it down. I wanted you to read that to you again. When the world is uncertain and when answers aren't clear, help us be still and know that you're God. Quiet us, calm us, shepherd us. Now, Abram isn't quite there yet. I mean, he's making progress, but he's still got his fears. He's still got his questions. And there are still a lot of things about the situation that Abram doesn't understand. So what does God do next? Remember, God comes here because he wants to help Abram through his fears and his floundering faith and lead him back to a place of greater faith. So when Abram expressed his doubts and his fears, God listened. He didn't yell back at Abram for his doubts and fears. He just listened, and then he answered. Although he didn't answer by immediately changing Abram's situation or giving him what he wanted, Abram was still going to have a lot of waiting to do for that one. But what God did was, he repeated the promise again, and this time with a little more specificity. I'm reading now from verse 4. Then a message from the Lord came to Abram. The Lord said, "When you die, what you have will not go to this man. You will have a son of your own. He will get everything you have." The Lord took Abram outside and said, "Look up at the sky. Count the stars if you can." Then he said to him, "That's how many children will be born into your family." Now my question as I'm hearing that is, why does God repeat the promise again when he knows that Abram is already doubting the promise? Well, I think it's because God knows that it's our faith and obedience actually follow his promises, and that the promise actually gives us the power to push through our fear and to get to a place of greater faith. That's another one of the things that doing the verse of the day and going to in-person worship, or here at Concordia going to Friday faith nights, really helps me with, because when I do that, I'm reminded of God's promises. I'm just reminded of God's promises, and you know what? When stuff is really hard, or when I'm starting to get afraid or worried or thinking that this waiting is taking too long, hearing God's promises again, it's something that I really need. And then you look at Abram's story, and here's the beautiful part. You see that faith and obedience did follow God's promises. All right, God showed Abram that he was not alone, and he came to him in his fears, and he helped Abram remember to focus not just on the situation, but on the relationship. And then he repeated the promise, and then we get this sentence, verse 6. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Abram's faith is stronger now. Stronger than it was when God first started talking to him. Though he's still got a long ways to go. All right, Abram is less afraid and is starting to believe again, but his faith is far from perfect. In fact, Abram, like a whole lot of Bible characters you'll see, is still looking for more evidence that what God says is true. A couple of sentences down, verse 8, let me read it to you. But Abram said, "Lord and King, how can I know I will have this land as my own?" How can I know? How can I know for sure? God, show me something, please. And God's so good that he does. Right? Instead of berating Abram for his lack of faith or his slowness in his faith getting stronger, God helps Abram take some more steps into greater faith. And so God gives Abram something else to hold on to. We read that starting at verse 9. Listen.
So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a young cow, a goat, and a ram. Each must be 3 years old. Bring a dove and a young pigeon along with them." Abram brought all of them to the Lord. Abram cut them in two and placed the halves opposite each other. But he didn't cut the birds in half. Then large birds came down to eat the dead bodies of the animals and the birds, but Abram chased the large birds away. As the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep. A thick and scary darkness covered him. Then the Lord said to him, "You can be sure of what I'm about to tell you. For 400 years your family who comes after you will be strangers in another country. They will become slaves there and will be treated badly. But I will punish the nation that makes them slaves. After that, they will leave with many possessions. But you will die in peace. You will join the members of your family who have already died, and you will be buried when you are very old. Your children's grandchildren will come back here. That's because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached the point where I must punish them." The sun set and it became dark. Then a burning torch and a pot filled with smoking coals appeared. They passed between the pieces of the animals that had been cut in two. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram. He said, "I am giving this land to your family who comes after you. It reaches from the river of Egypt to the great Euphrates River."
So in Abram's day, you'd call what we just read a covenant ceremony. Now, covenant isn't a word that we use very much today, but if you substitute the word agreement or commitment or contract, be the same sort of idea. And we're used to commitments or agreements or contracts being, well, two-sided. It's like, you do your part, I do my part, and everything's good. Actually, it was kind of like that in Abram's day, too. Covenants were two-sided. You both agreed to do something, and then, hey, we're good. But that's not what's going on here. Here something is different than what usually happened with the covenants. In Abram's day, to seal a covenant, they would do something that's called, well, cut a covenant. That's actually what's pictured here. Abraham, you'd go out and get some animals, like Abram does here, and then you'd cut them in half, like Abram does here. And then both parties to this agreement or covenant would walk through the animals to seal the agreement. But if you go back and look at those verses again, there's something interesting you notice there. Abram doesn't walk through the animals at all. He's shooing the birds away from the animals, but he doesn't walk through the animals at all. The only thing that walks through the animals there in the vision is what we read here as a burning torch, what other translations call a smoking fire pot. In either case, that's a symbol for the presence of God. So what's happening here in this vision is it's saying God is the only one who walks through here. Meaning this covenant isn't two-sided. This covenant is unilateral. This covenant, God says, is one-sided. Totally one-sided. God obligates only himself to implement his promise, and he doesn't make any conditions or stipulations on Abram. And here's why. See, God doesn't want our mistakes to mess up his promises. And so, knowing how flimsy and fickle our commitments can be sometimes, God here is saying, I'm going to take this one all on myself. I'm going to take it all on myself to make sure that these promises come true. And you know what? When I see that, that commitment by God actually, I think, helps my faith to grow stronger. Because when I see, like Abraham here, that God is willing to do everything to make this covenant happen, it helps me see the depth of his love. And the depth of his love helps me to trust him more, to trust the relationship, to trust that he is going to keep his word and his promises just like he said. And if you look back, you might discover that the story here even hints at something in God's bigger story. It's back in that phrase, cut a covenant. You see, in Abram's day, the way they sealed that agreement as they walked through, it was both parties walked through the animals as a way of saying, well, if I mess this up, then you get to mess with me. Well, God knows that we're going to mess up our part of things. I mean, God knows that even with our best efforts, we're really not capable of keeping the commitments that we make to Him all the time. That even when we want to put God number one, not somewhere down in a list of 1 to 10, we're not always going to do that. And even when we want to keep the commandments, we're not always going to do that. And that even when we're trying hard, we're still sometimes going to get it wrong. We're still sometimes going to go back on our word. We're still not going to keep our part of the bargain. And yet God wants us to keep our part of the bargain. He wants our faith and obedience. But God wants us even more. God wants us even more. And so God says, I'm going to keep that promise for both of us. I'm going to keep that promise for both of us, and so I'm going to walk through here for both of us. And when we broke our promises to Him, well, that is exactly what God did. God Himself took our place, and God Himself willingly allowed Himself to be, well, sort of like cut up like those animals there and bloodied and killed and sacrificed on the cross to pay for us breaking our word. I mean, let that sink in. God Himself became the sacrifice in order to keep His promises to make us His children, in order to keep His promises to make us a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, in order to give us this eternal land that we call heaven, in order to be in a relationship with Him forever. The cross of Christ, that's the cost of God keeping His word and fulfilling the promise. Aren't you glad that He did? So back to the beginning. What are you afraid of right now? What are you worried about? Where's the waiting on God sort of getting to you? The fears are real. But so is the God who's with you in those scary times. And remember what we've seen. God's aware of your fears and your floundering faith. And God, in your fears, He comes to you to help, even before you ask Him for help. And God redirects you then so you can think about not just the situation you're in, but the relationship that you're in. And then God repeats His promises. He repeats His promises again because God understands that our faith and obedience follow His promises, and His promises actually give us the power to grow in our faith. And then God points to His sacrifice. He points to that sacrifice to remind you that He always keeps His word, no matter what it takes, no matter what it costs, no matter how hard it is, even if it's the hardest thing in the world to do. Romans 8 puts it pretty well. God did not spare His own Son. He gave Him up for us all. Then won't He also freely give us everything else? Aren't you glad that when you're afraid, or when the waiting on God is getting to you, that's what our God is like?